I'm with Fair Vote Edmonton. Growing up, my parents didn't really talk about politics. It's not because it was a taboo subject, it's just because I don't think they were that interested. So it wasn't really on my radar when I moved out. The first election that I was eligible to vote in came and went. I didn't pay any mind, mostly out of ignorance. The second election, I decided I'm an adult, I'm out on my own. I am going to be a productive citizen. And so I started looking into the different policies from the different parties for the very first time, found one that fit with my needs, and I voted. I remember watching the election coverage afterwards and seeing my riding immediately turn the other color, not the one I wanted. And I thought, well, that's too bad. I looked into the history of my riding and found out that it had always voted that way, basically since they'd been taking records. And this happened several more times. And I came to realize that the current system doesn't necessarily reflect the views of our upcoming youth. It doesn't reflect the views of our minorities, and it doesn't push our leaders for effective change. Remember, I was in college at the time, and so I was trying to get out the vote and get my friends to come out, and they'd say, well, one vote doesn't really matter. And to be honest, sometimes I'd have a hard time disagreeing with them on that. I started looking into how we can change this and came across proportional representation. A class of electoral systems that ensures that every vote is counted. It works to make sure that 40% of the vote doesn't get 60% of the seats, that every vote means something, and we aren't forced to vote strategically between parties that we don't really care for just so the other doesn't get in. Countless votes are slipping through the cracks in our country, and countless more voters are apathetical and aren't even showing up to the polls. So I ask you, if you haven't heard of proportional representation, go home and do just a few minutes of Googling tonight and read up on it and see if it fits with your values. And if you have heard of it, consider talking to your representatives or attending one of our meetings. We meet monthly, and again, that's Fair Vote Edmonton. And I want to thank Joel for the few minutes I've been given today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brad. And Fair Vote does, Brad probably mentioned, but has a table at the back. A lot more information there. You can get it there. We're going to show you a quick 2.5-minute video that we put out just a few days ago about post-secondary education, and then we're going to get into our session.
Without adequate investment, fewer students are going to be able to contribute to society and the economy going forward in the future.
The government makes post-secondary education higher quality largely just by investing more with the head. And I think that in large part, it's not just through a funding model that's based on like outside donations. It's also one that's based on just like knowing that we're always going to have a sustainable source of income and just money and funding for universities across Alberta and across Canada as well.
The effect of large class sizes on students in the arts faculty is that it alters the way we can communicate different kinds of knowledge and engage and involve students in their own education. Currently, I don't have the resources to offer small group tutorial sessions. I can't predict what kind of teaching resources I'm going to have from year to year.
So government investment in post-secondary education is particularly important for Alberta if we want to have a vibrant economy and a vibrant society moving forward. It's a universally accepted fact that investment in post-secondary education results in strengthening our economy.
What the government can do to create more of an accessible campus community is just ensuring that they're providing funding in a more holistic model, understanding that all students come from diverse backgrounds, whether it be their ability to access more textbook costs on campus, or whether it be their inability to find more loans or scholarships or grants that apply to them. I think it's important that our governments are understanding that no one student is like another. The number one message I want to send to government is that Alberta has the lowest participation rate of students in post-secondary education. We have the worst granting model in Canada, and we have really poor mental health supports. Investing in students today means that you're investing in an Alberta of tomorrow, and it's important that government officials are listening to the needs of students, bringing students to the table when they're making decisions, and ensuring that every single student on campus and across Alberta is represented in their policies.
All right, so that's another one of the materials we've been using to try to highlight public services in the lead up to this election campaign. So I now want to call up Rod Phelan, who's the Vice President with the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, to introduce the next panel, Just Transition and a Green New Deal for Canada. Please welcome Rod.
Probably a little low for me. Morning, everyone. I want to take you back to October of last year when AUP's Environmental Committee placed a resolution on the floor for debate. Therefore be it resolved that AUP support a just transition for workers, and therefore be it further resolved that AUP supports the efforts of any workers to negotiate just transition language into their collective agreements. And we were prepared for a bumpy ride when we put this out there. We purposely left the wording vague. After all, how do you plan for something when you can't really predict all the myriad of ways it could impact your job, your economy, your lifestyle, and your workplace? We know the renewable wave is coming, but how do you craft articles and agreements when there's so much uncertainty and so much resistance? We really weren't sure if our members would get it, but they got it. A large majority of the 950 plus delegates, representing 95,000 public sector employees across the province, they get it. Because it will impact direct government employees and the services they deliver to Albertans. It will impact healthcare in every aspect every day. It will transform education as we plan for transition and train Albertans to adapt, survive, and thrive. And that's just within our own organization. Fast forward to today, and what's the bigger picture? This isn't the first huge technological change we've had to face, but it may be one of the most important if we don't get it right. So this session will explore how we can build just transition to a 100% renewable energy economy in Alberta and across Canada in a way that upholds Indigenous rights, expands racial justice, and guarantees good work for everyone. Now I'd like to take just a moment to introduce the panel that will be delving into this topic. Ty is Eagle Clan, and he brings an Indigenous perspective to this conversation. He champions their inclusion and active participation, even direction, for a just transition and opportunities it presents. Stephen brings perspective of real working people who are concerned about climate change and want to be a part of the solution. And Emma, who is also with Climate Change Edmonton and has done some work with the Parkland Institute, just wants to make sure that the biggest crisis that we're facing can also be our biggest opportunity. So welcome to the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rod. So I'm sort of going to be playing a little bit of
All right, much better. now you don't need to be anxious in your seats that that's going to happen again unexpectedly at any moment. Yeah, so in your handbooks it sort of says that I will be moderating this panel. I'll also be sort of playing double duty and speaking a little bit as well. I just wanted to lay that out there so that you don't think of me as a moderator that's taking up a lot of space. I want to start off by acknowledging that this event, the conference that you are at, is taking place on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation. And I acknowledge that I'm sure it was brought up at the beginning of this conference, but for us, specifically as climate justice organizers, it is at the core of the work that we are trying to do, is really grappling with how we come into a renewed treaty relationship with Indigenous peoples and what that looks like to uphold Indigenous leadership and to fight for Indigenous sovereignty on this land. And I think that that is critically important as well to bring up in this space because it's so central to what we are trying to aim towards with the Green New Deal. And in talking about a just transition is really understanding how Indigenous sovereignty needs to be a key pillar of what that looks like. So I thought that we would start off by sort of laying out and not spending too much time on it because I think that we all know the level of the crisis that we're in, but talking about why it is that we need a just transition and what the sort of current political context is that we find ourselves in. So I guess the way that I really approach this work, and I think all three of us have very different perspectives and reasons why we're here and why we're grappling with the climate crisis in the way that we are. For myself personally, I am 26 years old. I grew up in the Canadian labor movement. My dad used to bring me on picket lines when I was really young. And for me, the year that I was born, world leaders met for the very first time in Rio de Janeiro to talk about climate change. So I've grown up in this crisis, and I have spent my entire life basically watching as world leaders fly around to Davos and to COP and so on, and systematically fail to live up to the urgency that we are currently seeing with this problem. And I know that I'm not alone in feeling that way and feeling that anxiety and sort of level of desperation. And so I think what's critical with that is, in a lot of ways, this work isn't optional for many of us. And so you'll notice that all three of us are millennials. Being born into this crisis means that it fundamentally is robbing us of our futures, and that's why we're engaged in the work. Just last week, there was a report that was leaked out from the government of Canada that actually said that Canada is now warming at twice as fast as the rest of the world. So we know that we are in the midst of this crisis. It is not, coming later on, and we can't even say, we're going to be okay, but it's mostly the global south, and the global south is feeling the impacts of this right now. We saw that in Mozambique, we saw that in Malawi, in Zimbabwe. Over 1,000 people died just 3 weeks ago, and that literally made a blip in the international news cycle. So basically, I think just to set out the context that it's like we are in the midst of a crisis. The wildfire season in BC has already started, and we know, every single one of us in this room knows that anxiety that we all felt when we couldn't see the sky above our heads for 2 summers in a row, and anticipating that that is going to be the exact same thing that is going to happen again this summer, and that it's already happening. So really wanting to lay that out there, that we are in a moment of crisis that demands that we rise to the occasion of it. From the perspective of climate, but also our two fellow panelists are going to talk about why it is this moment that is really bringing these overlapping crises together, and why the solution to the problem needs to do the same. So I'll pass it off to Ty.
Yeah, so with climate change, Indigenous sovereignty is going to play a big role in reducing the impacts of climate change. Indigenous people have been at the front lines of climate change for hundreds of years. Since the Europeans first came here, decided they want to live here, and terraform the land into farms, mines, overfishing, taking all the trees. We've been at the forefront of climate change. Resource extraction, climate change, and settler colonialism go hand in hand. In hand. In hand. They dance in a circle, square dance. And so Indigenous sovereignty is going to help reduce the immediate impacts of climate change by stopping pipelines. If you look at the Coastal Gas Link in BC, some Wet'suwet'en people are stopping that pipeline from passing through. They are making sure that the pipeline doesn't go through their land to affect the salmon, to affect the water, to protect the ecosystem for everybody, for their people and for the settler folk who also need to live off of the water.
So I'm a machinist actually. I've been a machinist for the past 10 years. Actually grew up in Stony Plain, and I grew up to a father who also worked in the oil industry. So, you know, the problem, I guess, like we as working people will also have to deal with climate change. We're going to see a change in economy. We're going to see a change in our jobs. We're going to see a change in where our jobs are, what our jobs are. And yeah, you know, we've been dealing with in the high carbon economy that we've been working in. It has led to a lot of precarious work. You know, we've been subject to the boom and bust economy where, you know, right now my dad has been sitting on his board for a few months, you know, waiting for another job to come up. And, you know, it's almost unnecessarily cruel, to say the least. Yeah, and, you know, we are being more and more automated out of our jobs as well. You know, and, you know, it's only serving to give money to the higher ups in the corporations, and we're not seeing a lot of benefit for working people on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing that I just want to add, and that I think has probably been talked about a lot over the course of this conference and will continue to be talked about, that we are seeing astronomical levels of economic inequality at the same time that we are grappling with the climate crisis. And so understanding that those things are also fundamentally linked. I was in Ottawa just last month for a massive convergence of young people to talk about climate. And the day after the conference happened, the Yellow Vest convoy arrived downtown in front of Parliament Hill. And I went out to a counter rally with some friends, but sort of approached it with the sort of understanding of like wanting to hear in some ways why folks were there. And I think one thing that we're seeing and that we're so intimately, I think, familiar with now in Alberta is that this rise of white supremacist hate groups is intimately tied to this level of precarity in our economy. And so with that, I think we need to grapple with the fact that we are not going to be able to fight white supremacy in this province and across the country without coming up with a solution that is much bolder than any false promise of a pipeline that is ultimately going to create 90 full-time permanent jobs. It's not sufficient. And so understanding that like this bigger vision that we're going to start talking about now is actually the solution to economic precarity, to the climate crisis, to this absolute failure to live up to our obligations to Indigenous peoples on this territory. And I fundamentally actually believe that this kind of new economic paradigm that we are trying to usher in, and that the climate crisis provides us the opportunity to usher in, is going to be something that people can finally tie themselves to. And I say that because I actually spoke with some of these yellow vesters at this rally, and it was really shocking because I think, you know, they think, obviously because I was in Ottawa, and I actually am from Ottawa, so, you know, we're just like the Ontario elites, right? And we don't understand, and we don't know what it's like to go through this sort of boom bust cycle. And as soon as I said, you know, I actually traveled from Alberta to be here, they were in shock. Like, they couldn't understand, how is it that you're from Alberta, but you're on the other side of this whole, you know, struggle. And so then starting to say, like, you know, these corporations and the companies that are employing you, they actually don't give a shit about your jobs. I'm sorry, but they don't. They are cutting your jobs the second that the price of oil falls. And yeah, Brad said I worked for the Parkland Institute. I literally have spent days in their financial reports, and I know that they are raking in millions of dollars at the same time that they are cutting jobs and that they are automating the industry. And workers understand that. When I said that, they were like, yeah, but I work for a small company. So they know there's an inroad there. And so if we're able to start to lift up this solution of a Green New Deal, this is the way that we can start to pull workers in and that they can start to sort of see themselves within it. I think we wanted to talk a little bit now about like the biggest barriers, which obviously we've already sort of started to talk about, but maybe, yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about like what you see as being the biggest barriers so far towards this level of action and actual like rightful relationship with Indigenous peoples as well.
Yeah, so I think the biggest barriers for there being an attitude adjustment, so I think that's really what's needed, is there's a lot of small groups of people who want to change things, but there's not a lot of intergroup solidarity and communication and relationship building, because there's a lot of division based on race or class, education, basically ways of getting to that change. And so a lot of those barriers need to get overcome in order to be able to build that critical mass of people to influence policymakers. But before the policy making has to get done, attitudes have to be changed, because that's what creates the policy, is attitudes. So when I think about like attitudes that are actively supporting these barriers, in terms of like Indigenous sovereignty and the denying communities rights to veto projects that go through their land or that negatively affect them, a lot of it has to do with Canadian dominance through the Indian Act, through very racist beliefs that white people are superior than Native people. And that attitude plays out in courts, it plays out in law, in the Indian Act, it plays out in dealing with health services. It comes down to like even on the job site. I'm an iron worker, Local 720. There it is. But even then, on the job site where they're building, there's still like racist things I have to deal with. And those are barriers between us making changes, between workers trying to come together. There's ideas that like split people, and that makes it easier for like divide and conquer tactics, basically, for these businesses who have so much power, who work so well with government. They're just married, a happy couple, polygamous couple that likes to bounce around different industries, and yeah, very abusive. It's abusive marriage. They're cheating on each other. Freaking beating people up with the cops, like, and that's like you know, like that's like where attitudes need to change. You know, like the way things are now is the way things have been for the last few decades. That is why we are where we are today. There's people who don't understand what it's like to be on the front lines making decisions that impact the front lines of climate change. And we need to stand together, build a critical mass, and change things before it's too late.
I think we're also going to need to put forward a really compelling vision, for workers, and really hand over ownership to creating like a just transition and a Green New Deal, and like getting investment from working people, because right now, within the industry, we're not really given the space to oppose more growth in the oil industry and more growth in a high carbon economy. We are expected to stand up for pipelines and drive around in convoys. And I don't think most of us, or I think that there are many of us in the oil industry who understand that like we do need to transition away from a high carbon economy. We need to invest in our future, and the only way to make those moves is to engage workers, give people ownership, and give them a bold vision, something to really get excited about. Because like right now, we're getting policies coming down from higher ups that we don't really feel connected to. They feel disconnected from us, so we need to be collaborating amongst communities, working people, migrant workers as well, Indigenous communities, making this a big broad movement, to bring everybody in and pull so that we can all pull in the same direction.
Great. I think I just have one big barrier that I sort of want to add. There's a lot of them, and I understand that. One of the biggest things that has been consistently standing in our way of obviously tackling the climate crisis at the level of action that is necessary is that this neoliberal logic has become so embedded that we can't even fathom the fact that we need massive government intervention in order to tackle the scale of this crisis. And so what I think is so powerful about that is that so many of you in this room are chipping away at that same logic and understanding and fighting back against the privatization of our public services, about fighting back against cuts to healthcare, fighting for universal childcare, and so on. And so understanding that the Green New Deal is this incredible framework that we will not be able to win until we are able to tear down that logic of small government. And so I think with that, it allows us to sort of broaden this perspective to understand that it's like we are in so many ways all pulling in the same direction, and you might not recognize the work that you're doing as being related to climate justice, but it is. If you are fighting for universal childcare, that is fighting for a climate just future, that is valuing good work, that is low carbon. And so understanding that we need to be expanding the low carbon sectors of our economy, and reevaluating what it is that we value in a society and what we want that to look like. So the fact that we want healthy people, we want seniors to be taken care of, understanding that providing good jobs in those sectors is fundamentally part of the transition that we're talking about. And I do think that the labor movement is really starting to understand this and grapple with that. The other, the sort of biggest barrier here is that our governments have obviously become so captured by the oil and gas industry. And I think that is like particularly pronounced, obviously, here in Alberta. And for those of you who haven't read Kevin Taft's book, The Deep State, would highly recommend that to understand that further. Yeah, but we see that in the fact that, you know, our federal government was willing to spend $4.5 billion on the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline instead of investing that money in renewable energy, investing that money in this, you know, economy that we need to be moving towards. All right, so now let's get to the fun part of things. I think the biggest thing, and it was great, Rod, that you introduced this panel with that AUPE sort of proposal, is that right now the Green New Deal is really like, it's a values-based box that we have the opportunity to fill. Understanding that it's like, we're not going to win without a really massive broad-based coalition. And so understanding how you see your work fitting into it and what pieces and pillars are most important to you that you want to be in that. And I think that's incredibly important, both as it's just like a moral imperative of understanding that we can't speak on behalf of all communities that are going to be affected by the transition, and so they need to be a part of saying what they want, but also it's a strategic imperative. It's understanding that it is strategically sound to be pushing forward a bold vision where people are able to start to articulate what pieces they want to be in that. And so migrant justice advocates being able to come forward and say, this is what is critically important to migrant workers in the country, and how a Green New Deal could address their issues. So maybe let's get started with some big thoughts of like, what are the pieces and the things that you want to see within a Green New Deal? What is most important to you?
So, I'm sure most of you have heard of the Green New Deal down in the United States, pushed forward by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And some of the ideas that I've heard kind of swirling around it, you know, there is like a really great push for a good work guarantee, and making sure that, you know, they're understanding that there are people who are going to just not have jobs available in a low carbon economy, in a zero carbon economy, and that they do still want to contribute to their communities, and making sure that, you know, they can contribute to their communities in positive ways, whether it, you know, be street beautification or you know, even going to a retraining program, and making sure that everybody still feels that they will be supported through the whole transition. But I think that we also do need to keep in mind when we're talking about these solutions that for a lot of us tradespeople, our trades are transferable across economies. You know, I'm a machinist, so I make parts. I can make a part for a wind turbine just as easily as I can make a part for an oil derrick, for an oil pipeline. So I think that maybe you know, it is worth mentioning that, like, possibly, you know, one of the barriers that we need to keep in mind is that a lot of working people do get anxious about the training, that they're going to have to completely, you know, spend another 4 years starting at the bottom of an industry, when, like, really, like, if you're a welder, you can still weld. If you're, you know, there will be work opportunities in a low carbon economy for a lot of tradespeople. We just need to, you know, illustrate that for people that, yeah, that we can build new infrastructure that will be used positively in this low carbon economy. Yeah.
So, in a just transition, that would involve, I think, a just transition is, I think, equal parts environmental justice and social justice. Because of the relation between resource extraction and settler colonialism, there's been a lot of laws and police force and like child and family services, basically these big institutions to take Native people away and destroy them, more or less, and make us dependent on the welfare state. It started like way back when settlers were first coming here, trees are being made, buffalo were killed, and told to be on reserves or else we're going to be arrested or killed. And then once we're on reserves, police on there, and the only people that would give us food were the government, and that was like a way of fostering dependency, forced dependency. So, I mean, that's like a long story, but part of a just transition would involve giving opportunities to First Nations to have opportunities to become like first energy independent from the grids surrounding them, having to put all this money in for water and all this money in for power, which would allow more money to go towards what each individual band needs. But that would also involve training workers who want to be there and giving them more independence. Another part of that is getting more land back, because there's not enough land for Indigenous people. I think like it's like less than 1% of Canada's landmass is reserved land, and so that needs to change. That's unjust, and that's part of how this just transition is doing justice. Just say the word so many times. I'll just say it one more time. Justice. Sounds so nice. Yeah, so having more land to practice culture, to this culture that is so in, like we are part of the land. We're not above land. We don't look at the land like it's just something to exploit. That we are a part of the land. We are the land. We are water. And that's why we have to fight so hard for it. That's why we fought so hard for it. And that culture is getting lost because of the hold that Canadians and Canada has on bands and Native people, forcing us into poverty, forcing us into jail, forcing us into these group homes, into residential schools. It's just like, it's killing our culture. And that culture is what can save this world. That's what is going, that's where so much teaching, so much Indigenous knowledge on how to relate to the land, how to relate to one another in a healthy communal way is, and that's getting lost because of settler colonialism, because of resource extraction, because of the toxins spewed by the oil sands into the nearby reserves. There's higher rates of cancer. Those are frontline effects, and those people from those bands aren't seeing the same economic benefits that Albertans do, that Canada as a whole receives because of laws, because of policies. So those things need to change. Environmental justice is social justice, and we all need to work together for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest and most exciting things about a Green New Deal and a just transition is it is about reframing and understanding that we can create public luxury for all instead of public luxury for a few. And so that is about, massively expanding free public transit. It is about looking to models that are already being created. So Cup W, the incredible campaign that they've put forward of delivering community power, which could help to use our postal network. There are currently more Canada Post outlets across the country than there are Tim Hortons. So how is it that we can take infrastructure that already exists in order to start building this? So there are concrete ways forward that are already being proposed. Like Ty said, like democratized renewable energy projects that are owned by community and that put ownership and that wealth back into our pockets collectively. So it is about seeing that a Green New Deal is a tool for us to put people before corporate profits and to start to understand it in that way of like, this is how we can get there, and this is a concrete tool to move us towards that. I guess the final thing that I'll say, I think we're going to open it up to questions, is that I think for way too long, what we've thought about with the just transition is it's been so limited of we're moving from one source of energy to another. And we're just flipping from fossil fuels and then we need it to be renewable energy. And if you leave with anything, it is that we can reevaluate how we want our economy to operate and who it operates for. And so what is absolutely needed and what can happen in tackling the climate crisis is starting to really invest in care, invest in all of these sectors of the economy that actually allow us to lead fundamentally better lives. Yeah, maybe let's open it up for questions. I don't know how that works.
We've got a mic floating around.
Thank you for that presentation. I just have a question, and I think that the majority of the people that we speak to have issues with. For me, this whole just transition, this Green New Deal comes down to understanding the value of work. And from a class perspective, it's always been difficult to attach a certain value to work. I think the majority of people that are in the oil fields are people that are used to making incredible amount of money without any formal, without having had just, I don't want to sound condescending or anything, but you know what I mean. But they are used to making lots of money, and it's really difficult to convince somebody that the work that you're going to be doing is not going to bring that level of income, and that's what you see on Facebook all the time. And so how do you convince people or actually make that leap? Because it's a huge leap in terms of understanding the value of work. Because even understanding the value of work in healthcare, when we went on strike with the general services, the bargaining team had said, that the general services workers were a dime a dozen, that any monkey could do that work. So when we went on the Wildcat strike, we closed the hospital down, right? And so the importance of those jobs were clearly there because we shut the hospital down. Doctors can't do their jobs without somebody cleaning the floors. But how do you move that? How do you move that needle? How do you move that conversation as a worker or even somebody who's in that climate justice work that you guys are so awesomely doing?
So honestly, it just comes down to engaging working people. We need to get that buy-in from them. We need to be reaching out to the working class people. People working in oil fields, and letting them know that, illustrating to them that this economy is not working in their best interest. It's working in the interest of, the CEOs of their companies. And we need to, be able to spell out to them that there is a better way, that the better way is reorienting the economy so that it works for everybody and not just for the top 1%. And making sure that we're bringing people, if we're going to bring people in to help shape what this Green New Deal looks like, that gets that buy-in, that gives them something to push for. It gives them a little bit more than just thinking about a pipeline and not really thinking very creatively. It allows people to think about, well, if I'm going to fight for something, I want to have that buy-in. And right now we've kind of only given working people one option, and this gives us at least a second option, if not multiple options that we can all push for.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I would say in terms of value of work, and I think you're absolutely right. I think ultimately, we do need to reckon with the fact that we are not building an economy where those workers are necessarily going to be making 180 grand over the course of a year in the way that they have become accustomed to. And that is why I think that in this very hyper-individualized society, what we've done is we've now, and it's true in a lot of ways, is that the value of your wages and how much money you get paid is so tied to the quality of your life. And so what it is about, I think, is fundamentally challenging that, again, going back to this private versus public luxury, and being able to really explain and create this vision where it's like you can actually have a better quality of life in this, you know, kind of future that we're building that is less tied to your individual ability to pay for it. And I think, you know, there's so many examples of the way that I think we can start to explain this. And I did research up in Fort McMurray for 2 years and spoke with a lot of workers, and just like the hours, the incredible amounts of hours that workers put in of overtime, and of not, you know, seeing their children, of having families that are stretched across the country, and starting to be able to communicate to people who I think fundamentally understand that it's like, a lot of people don't necessarily want to be living in that way. They want good work, they want to be able to provide for their kids. But I think that is such an incredibly important piece, is being able to really communicate the quality of life versus the value of work, the value of your wages.
Yeah, with like a lot of the 180K a year, that's a lot of overtime hours. That is like 10, 12-hour days, maybe even 14 in a camp, day in, day out, for weeks, to drive around in your nice vehicle for like a week or two, and feel good. When you're high. So you're gonna have lots more, like, there's gonna be a lot more time to be at home with family, and less stress, less addiction, less breakdowns, less, let's just be like a better place. Values.
Hi, it's Anna. I'm so happy that you're all speaking and being here, and that everyone else is here. I'm visiting from Winnipeg, Treaty 1. But I also, before I moved to Winnipeg, I lived in Fort McMurray for 5 years on my traditional territory, which is Denisotuni territory, and that territory has been protected by us forever. So when speaking of just transition and Green New Deal, I think it's also important to relate Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, like the violence against them is the highest violence across the world. It's forced upon our bodies, which is also Mother Earth, because our blood and our water, like our birth water, comes from Mother Earth. We drink that water. So when that water is being poisoned, our bodies are being poisoned. And when the children come out of our bodies, they're being poisoned. And it's just a never-ending cycle of abuse. But we can stop that abuse by protecting Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people and creating spaces for them, not necessarily allowing them to lead, but creating spaces for them and open opportunities for me to lead. Because when I lived in Fort McMurray, I woke up every morning to the smell of tar, like every single morning, and it broke me. It just is breaking me, and it broke everyone around there. The energy in the town is so low, and it's so negative, and the amount of exploitation in that area is insane, and it's helping nobody. The workers who are working on the tar sands, those are the frontline people who are getting all those toxins into their bodies. We need to protect those workers. We need to protect the land, because we are the land, as Ty was saying. And we're all part of this land, and we're all welcome here, as long as we're taking care of Mother Earth. Because if we're not taking care of Mother Earth, then get the fuck out of here. But a question that I would say is why are you doing this work? What keeps you going, and the spirit inside you, what are you fighting for? Because I'm fighting for the children and the water and the land and the sun on a child's face. That's what I'm fighting for.
Yeah, I think you and I fight for a lot of the same reasons. for me, I've experienced a lot of, I've been through group homes, foster care, dealt with racism from the police, have to deal with government policies, have to deal with just racism from everyday people. I have to when I try to connect with the land, I just see highways, farms. Oh, 10 trees, a forest compared to everything else. And it's like I just see how much is taken from me because of the need for this idea that you need tons of money to be happy or to have some sort of status. There's like a big hierarchy, people rich up top, bottom. Kind of reminds me of racism, people up here, down there, and who created your money and who creates white supremacy. Oh, weird intersection there. But yeah, so just like these systems that oppress, and a lot of the systems that oppress people also destroy the environment. And I look at my niece and nephew, my sister, and my honey, and my friends, and my family, little dogs and stuff, and it's just like these people won't be able to live, like our descendants won't be able to live if something isn't done, if there isn't a pushback against white supremacy, against anti-indigeneity, there won't be anything. And that's not something that I can let happen. I'm a warrior, and I'll fucking die for this. That's it.
I guess what keeps me in this fight is, fighting for the people around me. The people that I work on the shop floor with, to the people that I pass by on the street. I want to see a better life for them. I want to see the struggles of our daily lives, ease at the very least, if not end. I want to, I want to see an end to, the racism that we've seen in the Yellow Vest movement. The frustration that comes from isn't from a necessarily logical place. It's just a quick reaction. It's the easiest answer. When really, no, these issues that you're mad about are systemic. And, this is the fight that I want to be a part of, to end these systemic issues that people are turning to the worst parts of themselves. And, yeah. And, yeah.
Is there a website that we can send our young people to?
Yes, for sure. It's climatejusticeedmonton.com. I want to respond to I thank you so much also for bringing up violence against women and missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular. It's so incredibly important that we bring that into these conversations. I think for me, like I said, growing up in the Canadian labor movement, I think was very, very foundational to who I've become and how I've come to understand power. To me, I'll be straight up, I think that the climate crisis is the biggest opportunity we've ever had and the biggest chance we've ever been given to tear down capitalism and build a better world for all of us, and that is fundamentally why I'm a part of this struggle. The other thing that you asked, and that I think is so incredibly important, and I live in a house of climate justice organizers who are young millennials, and it is incredibly difficult to find hope. And I know that all of you probably feel the exact same way, especially in thinking about climate, but in all of the struggles that you are a part of. And so I want to read this, because I think to me it's the reason why I continue to do the work and how I've come to think about hope. It's a quote by Rebecca Solnit, and she writes, "Hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable." So I want to leave you all with that, because I think that in all of the struggles that we're a part of, it is really committing ourselves in this moment to the work and to that understanding that it's like, I think in working away and chipping away at all of these structures of oppression, that is how we are able to live in the present. So.
Okay, so my question for you, sorry, we're talking about getting buy-in from settler workers, about giving them a new idea of an economy. But how do we make sure that the new Green Deal doesn't just replicate the old economy? Like, the high-speed train company is still going to have a CEO who's going to care about their bottom line and not the worker, right? So how do we make sure that this new economy that we're pitching to workers, and settlers particularly, is actually going to be a difference? And like, I'm not going to take a pay cut to go work from an oil company to a solar energy company if I know my boss is still making billions of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, organizing and organizing really well. And I know that that's like a very simplistic response to that question. The way that I've been really thinking about it, sorry, and I said that of this idea that it's like we absolutely need a new political alignment in order to ensure that we can have massive government intervention, and that this just transition is not being led by Shell and Exxon and whoever else. And so I think that part of that is, yeah, it's incredibly difficult, but I think what we can see, and I guess the best way to sort of explain, for instance, the sort of theory behind this is when Harper came to power, in a lot of ways, that built a new political alignment across this country, right? You had like corporate CEOs from oil companies in Alberta that were sort of part of one tent, and somehow they were pulling in the same direction, for instance, as the elites from Toronto banks, but also newcomers to Canada who then fell into this camp of fiscal conservatism, and understanding that all of these different groups were pulling in this direction. And that has now kind of really made it very difficult to talk about this level of massive government intervention that is required. So I think what is needed in this moment is building up a new political alignment, and that is going to take labor, and it's going to take migrant justice, and it's going to take Big Green, and it's going to take us building alliances with partners that are very unconventional and that we wouldn't normally be sitting at a table with, and who we quite frankly have some contradictions with. And I think that there might be small gains that are won. I think maybe the NDP will put a Green New Deal on their platform in the lead up to the federal election. That really is like Green New Deal light, in the same way that you're talking about, and that is really just like helping to prop up perhaps private companies. And I think that it is continuing to organize and continuing to pull that political alignment further and further until we reach the point where it is fundamentally a different paradigm entirely.
Okay, I've heard a lot of some things that other people brought up that really connected with me, because I worked in post-secondary for 37 years, and I've seen the impact that the boom in oil patches had on our students coming through the system. I worked in a program that was traditionally male-dominated. At one point, we had over 80% young women in our classes because all the guys were out getting jobs in their oil patch. I don't think that's an accident. I also don't think it's an accident that most of the people who work in the oil patch are unorganized. They don't belong to a union. So how can we get them organized? How can we get them connected to what's really going on? Because you're talking about a major paradigm shift. So what kind of steps can we take? Because we do have to bring them in because they're grieving. Their way of life has changed and they're grieving. And the only thing they want to do is go back to that. We can't do that. That's not an option. So how do we bring them into our tent?
Knowing that we have a small window of time without the planet exploding on us until we change this paradigm.
I think it's giving them a really bold, a really exciting idea. You know, I think it's, yeah, to you know, get that buy-in, and to, yeah, really just like engage their imaginations, and really, you know, make sure that working people and all communities are leading this from the bottom up. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. A lot of people are upset that their way of life is changing. That's sad. I can understand a little bit, but yeah. So like, there's a certain culture of masculinity that I see present in a lot of different job sites, and amongst like who would be considered a tradesman, tradesmen. Which is like, you know, the dominant term, or the, yeah. So I think it takes like a lot to like think about like how, what cultural systems, whether it's through media, art, movies, how like we as men sort of police each other in terms of our behavior, and how we uphold this idea of masculinity, that we need to be in the trades to be validated as men, or to be in a position of power to be men, which is extremely colonial because that comes at the cost of that need for dominance goes over like over women, you know, that need for dominance is what fuels like racism. That need for dominance is what terra nullius was made of. What saying like looking at a tree and saying that is for me to make, that is my decision to make. You know, like that idea of masculinity, you know, it needs to kind of like grow. It needs to change. It needs to stop being supported by so many people, by so many systems, which is gonna take a lot. It's not easy because of how ingrained these ideas are, the way these identities are so ingrained in society. And so those need to be like dealt with internally before we start looking at how we treat each other, and then how we can change systems. So yeah, it's tough, but I think once more leaders come up to challenge masculinity and demonstrate that it's still possible to be a man without having these traditional characteristics, that more people will see, and more people will change, and that will lead to larger and larger changes.
Yeah, I think on the note of like how do we organize these workers, I mean, I'm speaking to like a group of organizers, and you know that the #1 rule of organizing is like to agitate people, and you know the golden rule of like anger is there before you get there, and your job is to channel it. And in some ways, and I think about this constantly, there is a lot of rage in this province, and there is a lot of rage in that industry. And so in some ways, how are we actually thinking of that as organizers as almost a gift. And understanding that it's like right now we are being out-organized. We are fundamentally being out-organized by the far right in this province, but there is rage, and our job is to channel that and redirect it. And I think what that looks like is meeting people where they're at and tapping into these very real grievances, and how that relates to like things that we are currently grappling with as well. Debt levels is something that like we talk about consistently, and so I don't know the answer. I'm not an oil worker, and I think that there are people who would have much better ideas of what that looks like. But I fundamentally believe that like if we start to see and understand that it's like, okay, the rage is there now. How do we direct it, and how do we actually start to see that as like this is actually an opportunity, if anything, for us.
Can I go? Sorry. My name is Tina. I'm from the Tahltan First Nation, which is northern BC. And we're not treaty at all. And we have a whole different relationship to the land, and it's based on a very spiritual connection to that land. And we have a lot of economic development, like tons of different things that are going on in our territory. But it's all done in a very, is grounded in ceremony and in understanding that spiritual connection. And it's interesting, anytime I come to something like this, I often sit and I reflect back on my teachings, which are about the sacred foods and circle of life. And some people might know it as the medicine wheel. So when you talk about healthcare, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual connection, and how that fosters well-being in an individual. When we talk about stuff like climate change, I'm often reminded of the teachings of what is our responsibility as a nation. And not just as a nation in all humanity is what our elders teach us, but individually where we come from as nations. And people often say, well, why are you as Native people or Indian people so uptight about the land? Because that's our responsibility. It's been given to us to be our responsibility. Just as the white nation has been given the responsibility of energy, just as the yellow nation has been given the responsibility of air, just as the black nation has been given the responsibility of water. And if everybody knew those teachings in the world, they would do things much differently. When we talk about air and air quality, what is the nation that has the worst air quality in our world? China. Where does the spiritual teachings of air come from? In Tai Chi, in yoga practice. But it's spiritually grounded in how to respond to air, in what is our reciprocal relationship with that. So when Native people talk about the land, it is about a spiritual connection to that land and our reciprocal responsibility in maintaining, preserving, protecting, respecting, and giving thanks for what that land gives to us. If you are from the white nation, your responsibility is to energy, fire. Sun was the first thing of fire for us, and energy. That responsibility lies with those people of the white nation. Now this isn't about in silo either, because part of what the sacred circle tells us is that we are all interconnected, and we all must learn from one another about how to live in those spiritual ways with what we have been tasked with. So when Indigenous people talk about their connection to the land and the importance of that, it's about the spiritual connection, which is something we never talk about in anything that we're talking about even today. Whether it's healthcare, the importance of spirituality and healthcare, and the outcomes that that can produce are amazing. So much research around that. About our spiritual connection to the environment. And if we talked about that, this would be a whole different conversation that we would be having.
Hi, I'd like to say, like all of us, we are like a sleeping giant. We should be awakened. And we shouldn't be talking about minimum wage. What should be the minimum wage? We should be talking about what's the maximum wage. Because when you have corporate CEOs that are making like 20 million, 40 million, like what does that equate to? Like maybe 2,000 of their workers? It's ridiculous when there's individuals that are like worth $50 billion. Like what's the point of that? what we have to do is cap, maybe 10 million should be the top wage, and redistribute that amongst us. Somehow we think we'll all be the millionaires. Reality is we're sold on something that's not true. And I think we should redistribute that wealth, and it should go into education, health, and not all these military spendings, just ridiculous spendings that really serve no one except maybe the elite that have that company, shareholders. Like, we should wake up and say, hey, let's talk about maximum wage and redistribute what we have, and it would make others think, well, what am I working for? How should we work? I think it would really make the place much better that way. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to go off of that. I'm really glad that you brought up the military. And I think that that is something that has been missing from the climate movement for far too long. And understanding that, like, the U.S. military is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. And so if we are going to address the climate crisis, we're not going to be able to do that without tearing down the military-industrial complex. So
Hey, the question I have is how much discussion has taken place around shifting where resources are being used? The oil industry gets a lot of subsidy from government. There's also a huge infrastructure that's sitting there rotting in the oil industry, and the reclamation that needs to be taken for not only that, but when we look at the devastation around the tar sands or oil sands, there would be lots of jobs there to occupy people in. So has that been considered, and what do you have to say about it?
yeah, the number one thing, so there's currently a campaign that is underway, and it is called Reclaim Alberta. And would highly encourage you to check that out. And that is fundamentally addressing what exactly you were talking about. So the fact that we know we can put thousands of people back to work in actually reclaiming land and cleaning up old oil wells.
Yeah, I guess that just kind of goes to the whole idea of, having a good jobs guarantee. That is something that we could absolutely be talking about when we're pushing for this idea of a Green New Deal, is that, like, part of moving away from the economy is going to be cleaning up our mess that we left behind. So yeah, that's gonna be a huge boom for jobs for working people. It would be a great way to assuage any kind of anxiety that people might have about moving out of the economy. It's going to be, for a lot of oil workers, it's infrastructure that they understand. It's something that we can use them as the professionals that they are, and get them another way to get those people invested in this. Wrap it up. Yeah, if you want to say something.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say thank you all for really engaging in this conversation with us. As young people, I think doing this work here in one of the kind of most hostile environments as you can imagine to do environmental organizing, I think in a lot of ways what we're really hoping to do is model what it means to be coming from very different backgrounds, obviously, and being able to show, what is needed to scale up. And so in the lead up to the federal election, there will be young people organizing all across the country in order to put a Green New Deal forward and to ensure that every single one of our elected leaders does not have the option to avoid this issue, and that they have to say whether or not they support fundamentally transforming our economy in a way that is absolutely necessary right now. Because, yeah, I don't know about you, but I am ready to head to the polls sometime soon and make votes for people that are actually going to protect my future.
Vote in the events poll.
Well, that's a wrap for this session. I want to give a big thank you to Stephen, Ty, and Emma for giving us so many insights and leading such a great conversation. I think it was really illustrative, not only the sort of diversity of voices we are having on the stage this morning, but also the diversity of voices we've heard around the room, the kinds of different contributions we've had and different angles that we can approach this issue with. It's really inspiring to see all of that come together and for us to, I think, feel, I know that we have disagreements too, but we feel united, I think, when we're in a room like this and we know that we can unite around our values, and that's really inspiring to me. So thank you to all of you for